Shorna Gordon from Physiology and Biophysics. Got in touch with us a while ago and wanted to come up from South Campus to share with some departments up here about the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report on sexual harassment in our respective fields. So we kind of a natural partner to do that with her. Please have coffee and tea and sign in if you get a chance. Please, before you go, not if you get a chance.
Yeah.
And I'll let Shona take it from here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Thanks all of you for coming to listen. So I'm just a regular faculty member in physiology and biophysics, and I've been inspired by the new report from the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering that it's a tremendous and optimistic tool that community members, everyday members, can use to make our academic workplaces better. So this is the central metaphor of the report. It's an iceberg. And as you all know, 90% of the mass of an iceberg is below the waterline. And it's only the very tip, the top 10% of the mass that you see above the waterline. And about halfway through the discussion, I'll come back to this metaphor. But what you can just think about in the meantime is that there are forms of sexual harassment that everybody recognizes are sexual harassment. Sexual assault, coercion, unwanted sexual attention. We all know that those are sexual harassment. But there's a much more prevalent form of harassment called gender harassment, which comprises 90% of the incidents of sexual harassment. And we don't often know to name those as sexual harassment, but they are, and they're just as damaging as the stuff above the waterline when they permeate throughout the environment. So I'll start out by giving you an overview that talks about the impact of sexual harassment in science. Just in case you think that this isn't something that affects a lot of people, really the people who come to these discussions don't need to be convinced that it's an important topic, but I'll tell you what the report says about sexual harassment and why it's important. I'll tell you about the mechanics of how the report was done and go over very briefly an overview of its findings. I'll define harassment, going back to that iceberg. I'll talk about the prevalence, how common sexual harassment is in our environment, especially compared to other workplaces. And then most of the time, I'll spend talking about the role of climate and culture in preventing sexual harassment and what each of us can do to make sexual harassment not happen in our environments. So really, I'm just here because this is a topic that I'm passionate about. I'm much older than just about all of you, and when I came up through the ranks of science, it was definitely a lot worse. Dirty jokes by people in power, we just had to laugh at them. Put-downs of women who weren't committed because they had children, put-downs of gender minorities, commonplace. And we really just didn't have a language to describe it, let alone recognize that we didn't have to tolerate it. And what I've seen over the years is that things have gotten somewhat better, but glacially. The numbers play that out. I'm a physiologist. I study ion channels. They're proteins in cell membranes that facilitate electrical signaling along nerves. The fraction of faculty in physiology who are female today is about 30%. And in 1990, when I started graduate school, it was about 26%. So things are getting better, but not fast enough. And the question is really why? Because women have made up half of all PhD students and half of all postdocs, or more than half in the life sciences, for more than 25 years. So it's not a coincidence. We are doing something actively as a culture to drive women out of science, and we need to examine what those things are and change them. So that gets us to the impact of sexual harassment on science. Oh, and I should say, interrupt me anytime, So I'll go over these slides, which take maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. But even while I'm talking about this, shout out and we can stop and talk at any time. So sometimes when I address groups, they're groups of people who are part of the established scientific organization who've done pretty well for themselves. They've trained really good women. Some of their best friends are women. They might even, some of them, be married to women. And they don't think of themselves as harassers. They're good people. And they don't necessarily buy that they personally need to take an active role in reducing harassment because they're not part of the problem. So the report from the National Academy of Sciences tells us that if you care about the integrity of your science, the integrity of your work, then you need to think about sexual harassment. In 2017, there was a different report from the National Academy called The Integrity of Science. And that report talked about 6 values that need to be upheld for our scientific work to have integrity. The new report tells us that sexual harassment undermines at least 3 of those values. So one of them is fairness. And all of these words are specifically defined. So part of fairness is making sure that any judgments or evaluations that you make are based on transparent and appropriate criteria. Anytime a woman is judged in part based on her gender, that is not an appropriate criterion, so that's not fair. So that's come up for me in my line of work as editor of a journal. I don't have the resources to know whether in my journal, the Journal of General Physiology, we have bias against women. But a recent study deposited in bioRxiv of 24,000 submissions to the journal eLife did a really great analysis. You guys are statisticians, so maybe I should ask you how great the analysis was. But they compared submissions and looked at how well papers from male senior authors versus female senior authors fared, and compared whether there was a difference when the review teams, the team made up of reviewers and editors, was all male versus mixed gender. And what they found was that papers from male senior authors had about 11 percentage points more favorable chance of getting accepted than papers from female senior authors when the review teams were all male. And the difference for mixed gender review teams wasn't statistically significant, but it looked to me like the trend was there as well. Again, you're statisticians, I'm afraid to say that. So it's important to me to know whether the representation of women on my review teams in my journal is creating a bias, or even whether there is a bias, because that would not be an appropriate criterion to evaluate papers based on the gender of the senior author. Accountability is a second value that has to be upheld. So an accountable supervisor is one that's attentive to the career and development needs of their trainee. If you have a trainee who experiences any kind of harassment from a peer, harassment from you, harassment from somebody in the lab down the hall, you're not being an accountable PI. It is your responsibility to make sure that all of your trainees are protected from that kind of behavior. So saying, well, I'm not a harasser, I've never harassed anyone, I'm very respectful, I guarantee every single PI in this institution had a trainee who's experienced some kind of discrimination over the course of time. And the numbers that I tell you about later will bear this out. So stewardship is talking about making sure the people that you supervise have all the opportunities that they can to advance their work. So if you have a trainee who was left off a paper, or who was scared to go to a meeting because of harassment, or who was excluded from a project because they had a child and someone thought they wouldn't be really committed, There are so many ways in which discrimination can rob trainees of opportunities, and if anyone in your sphere has been affected in that way, then you're not being a good steward. So even if you're not someone who is a harasser, even if you call out harassment when you see it, if you care about the legacy of your scientific work, then you really do need to be part of the solution and actively work to reduce all kinds of discrimination. And I wanted to add that the report tells us that student-on-student sexual harassment is the most common form. So I'm not just talking about people in power abusing it to harass others. The statistic is likely due to the fact that there are more students around than anybody else. And it's certainly true that when harassment is perpetrated by someone who has more power, it can be even more damaging than when it comes from a peer. But it's pretty uncommon, and we'll talk about this later, for anyone to report sexual harassment and for students to report it to their PIs when it's not directly relevant to their relationship to the PI in their view. They just don't do it. And so our trainees could be experiencing harassment without our knowing it, and yet that's still our responsibility. So sexual harassment actually hurts people. It hurts people, both their professional and educational success. It hurts their health. People become physically ill, and it also negatively impacts their mental health. And it's not just the targets of sexual harassment who are hurt. Bystanders can have both physical and psychological symptoms from being bystanders to sexual harassment. Of course, it also can affect coworkers, both in terms of their enjoyment of their jobs and their productivity, and it affects institutions. It drives women out of science. We can't afford to put so many resources into training women just to have those women leave. It's really expensive to train people. Really, really expensive. And this creates really a vicious cycle in which some investigators train women, see them leave science, and then become less interested in training future women because they see them as risky, as investments. So it's a vicious cycle in which women leave science that creates an environment in which fewer resources are devoted to women, making it an even worse environment. That reduces the pace of progress. That decreases the talent pool. If I'm a great woman and I leave, it affects not only the loss of my productivity, but all the people who I would have interacted with become less productive. That loss of diversity negatively influences everyone's productivity. And really sadly, what we need more than ever are diverse role models. And when women and other marginalized people are driven out of science, we lose the opportunity for those people to be role models. So those are all reasons to care about sexual harassment, even if you're not someone who thinks about justice and equity. So I hope I've convinced you that we ought to care. Now I'll tell you just a little bit about how the report came about. So about 2.5 years ago, before the Me Too movement, there was a committee on the advancement of women at the National Academy, and the Academy decided that they should investigate what's happening in academic work environments in terms of sexual harassment. So they came up with this beautiful report. You can download this for free online. The organization that I'm working with here at the university, Below the Waterline, has a website, belowthewaterline.org. You can go to belowthewaterline.org and you can download, you'll see a link to this report. You'll also see a link to this slide set. You can see I'm recording here for Panopto, and I'll deposit also a recording, not necessarily of just this session, but splicing ones where I don't make mistakes together. And I really want to encourage people to talk about this report. It's a long report. This is a 300-page report. Maybe you don't have a week and a half to invest in reading it. If you want to know about what's in the report more thoroughly, but you don't have time, look at Chapter 7. It's the last regular chapter, and it's about a 15-page summary of what's in the report. So this report is a lot of things, but it's not everything. So this report is really starting from the data. They asked, based on the data, what can we say? It was done, by scientists, and they aren't just making things up. And it turns out there's a huge amount of bias in what's been the subject of research. So who's been the subject of research on sexual harassment? White women. And so from the data, they talk about what we know about sexual harassment of white women, and they're explicit about this, and they say they regret this, and we do know that for someone who is got an intersectional identity, say a woman of color or a gender minority, that it's highly likely that their experience of sexual harassment is even more damaging than for your typical white women. But because there aren't enough data, we don't know for sure what the numbers are in terms of prevalence. We don't know for sure about the effects. And we don't know for sure that the research that shows what's effective, what isn't, applies to anyone other than white women. But what I'll tell you today is that the report boils down to something really simple, which is that sexual harassment is just another kind of bullying. And that the factors that go into promoting bullying and sexual harassment are the same factors that promote bullying of anyone. And so I fully expect that a lot of the solutions that work for sexual harassment of white women will also work to reduce all other kinds of bullying and make our environment a much more welcoming place. So not only does this report review the literature, including cases, doctrines, and sociolegal methods, it also performed new experiments. 2 huge quantitative studies, as well as a very in-depth qualitative study to look at the prevalence and effects of sexual harassment. There are interviews, case studies, discourse analysis, and a review of about 4 decades of previous research on sexual harassment. So this is a very meaty report. Here are its key findings. Our current climate permits extensive sexual harassment, and we'll talk in a few minutes about what extensive means. That climate undermines research integrity, reduces the talent pool, and hurts people. The legal compliance approach that universities have taken up until now, not only hasn't it worked, but it's a big part of the problem. And I'm going to tell you terrible stuff, right? I've already told you terrible stuff. But I characterize this as an extremely optimistic report because the data show that when you improve the climate and culture, you reduce harassment and other kinds of bullying. So this is not an intractable problem. And the other thing that I'll tell you is that as members of our community, we have tremendous power to make change. So this, to me, was a transformative report that helped me see how much power I have as an individual, and hopefully you'll see that for yourselves as well. So what is sexual harassment? I'm not a social science researcher, so before I read this report, I thought I knew what sexual harassment was. And what I learned is that it's more complicated than that. So unwanted sexual attention, so unwelcome verbal or physical sexual advances, including assault, and sexual coercion, when there's some sort of pressure or quid pro quo for sex. Of course, I recognize those as sexual harassment. And, I didn't see that much of it happening around me. I mean, we hear of the rare cases of really bad actors. I thought that sexual harassment was pretty prevalent, but that's because I didn't know about gender harassment. So gender harassment is verbal and nonverbal behaviors that convey hostility objectification, exclusion, or second-class status about members of one gender. So that's everything from, well, I didn't expect you'd be able to understand this because you're a woman, to interrupting women when they speak. I was at a review panel for Ford Foundation grants. They're grants that go to members of the academy, particularly trainees who are working to advance diversity. And it was a great experience. The review panel had more women of color scientists in one room than I'd ever seen before. And what was amazing is that one of the women of color kept getting interrupted, just constantly. She couldn't open her mouth and say more than one thing and she'd get interrupted. And I noticed I was doing it too. I was interrupting too. And she spoke up and said, you know what, guys, this is not okay. This is bullying. And when that's done to a woman, that's gender harassment, man, right? That is a form of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is not wanting to give work to parents because you think they won't be as committed. It's all kinds of put-downs. So this, I think, is really, really important to know. Like all other kinds of bullying, sexual harassment is not about sex, it's about power. So interrupting women is about exerting power. Interrupting people of color, it's about power. It's about making yourself feel bigger by putting somebody else down. So that's true even for the come-on behaviors, right? Even if you keep pressing somebody for a date, even if you coerce someone to have sex, that's not about sex. That's about power. And we especially, as a culture, want to exert power over anyone who defies sociological norms. So anyone who in any way doesn't conform to our expectations, women, gender minorities, we want to put those people down, make sure they know what their place is. So we can view sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attentions broadly as come-ons, and gender harassment as put-downs. So gender harassment is the most common form of sexual harassment. It has negative effects on the targets, but it doesn't always have to be targeted. The report uses the word ambient, describing gender harassment as something like secondhand smoke. That when it's in the environment, it need not be directed toward any one person, and it can permeate as though through the air and sicken many, many people, including bystanders, team members, and other members of the community. It happens in environments which just have a general lack of respect. So gender harassment doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from an environment in which people on a regular basis are uncivil and don't treat each other with respect. So I've given talks like this and had people come up to me afterwards and say, gee, does the report have a list of things that I can and can't say? And my rule of thumb that I tell people is really very simple. Don't be a jerk. It doesn't come naturally for all of us. When I came up in science, it was very much show how smart you are by putting other people down. That was really normal in the culture. But it turns out that's not really healthy. That is not an environment that produces productive, happy, thriving individuals. And in fact, the kind of people who thrive in that environment are really not the kind of people that we want to have around at all. And I say that this is an incredibly optimistic report because the research shows that toxic environments that have worked hard to increase civility, kindness, and respect for others show a decrease in prevalence of sexual harassment and other kinds of bullying. And so there really is hope. So how prevalent is it? I thought that I'd experienced so much sexual harassment because I'm so beautiful. But it turns out everybody's experienced a lot of sexual harassment, and because it's not about sex, everybody's being targeted. So, I've talked to colleagues about this over the years, and they'd say things like, well, but if you went to work in corporate America, it'd be just as bad. If you went to work as a lawyer, it'd be just as bad. That's what I thought. Come on. It turns out that's not true. Okay, so look at this pie chart. This here represents the fraction of women, the percentage of women who've experienced gender harassment during the study period of about 3 years. More than half. This slice here experienced both gender harassment and unwanted sexual attention. So the first thing that tells us is that very few people experience only unwanted sexual attention. It almost always happens in the backdrop of gender harassment. So gender harassment and the uncivil, disrespectful environment that it comes from promotes the above-the-waterline forms of sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention. So this report compared the prevalence of sexual harassment in the academic science workplaces to public sector, private sector, and government workplaces, and found that it was the absolute very, very worst, except for the military. Okay? Only the military, of all the workplaces, has more sexual harassment than we have in academia. So it's not just that we're as bad as any place. We're worse. We're much worse. So why is that? So the report identifies some factors that contribute to having a lot of sexual harassment. And you'll notice that there's a lot in common here between academic work environments and the military. The most obvious is the hierarchical power structures. In academia, it's terrible, right? If you're working in someone's lab, you depend on them for a letter of recommendation. You've invested a lot in a project. It's work that you really care about. And you're answering to one person who may also control your funding. When you're an assistant professor, you rely on the senior faculty to vote for your tenure. You can't afford to piss them off by saying, hey, our environment's toxic. That hierarchical structure is permissive of sexual harassment. In academia, there's also a lot of isolation. So, I'm not familiar with how it works in biostatistics, but in some fields, there are field sites that people are at with one or just a few other people. In labs, people are just, nose to the grindstone, working on their own business. Students, postdocs, and other trainees work so hard that even when there are other people in proximity, they don't necessarily have much time or energy to interact. And that creates quite a bit of isolation. Another factor is the perceived tolerance of sexual harassment in academic workplaces. We don't expect that people who are sexually harassing others will be accountable for it. Policies that focus on protecting institutions from legal liability are another big factor, and we'll talk more about that. And this next one, these are not my words. These are words from the National Academy's report. Uninformed, unfocused, and uncommitted academic leaders. And finally, low representation of women in academic science leadership positions. So having more women in leadership positions isn't sufficient when you've modeled the behavior of those who've come before you, and that behavior is terrible. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you're going to perpetuate that behavior. And that's really an important point, that sexual harassment is not exclusively done by men. It's not even mostly done by men. Research shows that women gender harass other women as much as men do. And that's pretty bad, right? Because we even do it to ourselves. We underestimate our own capacities and underestimate our own worthiness. And of course, men may also suffer from imposter syndrome. That's not the exclusive purview of women. But I want to stress that being female being cisgendered doesn't exempt you from having to think about this. We've been raised in a culture that devalues women and gender minorities and people of color and people with disabilities, and all of us have internalized that to some extent. This report comes down hard on institutions. It says over and over and over again that the legalistic approach to curbing sexual harassment is part of the problem. So not only doesn't it work, it is extremely damaging. That institutions for years have focused on symbolic compliance of checking the boxes to say we meet the legal requirements instead of meaningful efforts to prevent harassment. Women rarely report harassment. That allows institutions to say, well, we don't have a big problem. We only had 3 reports last year. Why don't women report? Because women who report are punished. There are data in the report that talk about how women who report, as a rule, are retaliated against. It's not the exception. It is the rule for women to be vilified, marginalized, and excluded for reporting sexual harassment. Most harassment that occurs does not meet the legal definition for illegal harassment. So if our bar is, well, it's not illegal, that's bullshit, okay? Pardon my French. That sucks. As an academic community, we have a set of shared values in which every individual is valued for what they bring to the table. And if our bar is that we haven't illegally discriminated against someone, that doesn't reflect the institution I want. That doesn't reflect the institution that you have a right to. And so relying on legal compliance has actively created the problem because it sets the bar for behavior much too low. It also has reduced the efficacy of institutional efforts. The most obvious place where you can see this is in anti-harassment training. So the vast majority of kinds of anti-harassment training have never been evaluated for efficacy. And that's because if I, as an institutional administrator, do anti-harassment training, test its efficacy, and find that it wasn't effective, that opens my institution up to liability. But we need to know what's effective, because we shouldn't be doing the things that aren't effective, and we should be doing more the things that are effective. Even those kinds of anti-harassment training that have been shown to be effective, the effect has been shown to last an average of 2 days. Yeah. So another phrase that comes straight from the report is moral courage. It says institutions need to show moral courage. It takes moral courage to say, look, we're going to put the issue of legal liability aside and take care of our people. If you've said you've been harassed, we're not going to make you jump through hoops to prove it. We're going to help you. We're going to find out what you need as a student or a postdoc or a faculty member to thrive here. It takes moral courage to evaluate what you're doing, because it might mean admitting that it doesn't work and that you need to do something else. It takes moral courage to honor targets for reporting instead of marginalizing them. It doesn't have to be a choice between protecting the rights of someone who's perpetrated harassment and helping a victim of harassment. We can do both. We should do both. We must do both. And that includes increasing transparency. Again, you guys are probably have not been around long enough to see this, but like every other institution, the University of Washington does not want you to know the outcomes of its harassment investigations. And it takes moral courage to change that, to open up the doors and show what our mistakes have been, and have a community-wide discussion of how to do better. Okay, so that's the bad stuff. But what I really want to focus on is our communal power to change things and get things done. So I want to talk about the role of climate and culture. Organizational climate is by far the greatest predictor of the occurrence of sexual harassment. So I talked about how harassers can not just target one person, but they can produce this ambient secondhand smoke toxicity that affects many people. The converse is also true, that people who are positive role models that show respect and kindness and civility to everyone also create an ambient signal that emanates from them and affects everyone else too. That's amazing, right? That means that one person who changes their behavior can make a really big difference. That means that every time I interact with someone, every single day, those are all opportunities to change the environment, to change the culture, to model behavior that's based on our communal values. So the perception of an institution's tolerance for harassing behaviors is directly related to how much ambient sexual harassment there is. So as a community, we just have to say, you know what, I've had enough. I'm going to figure out what the problem is, and I'm going to change it. That gets us back to this central metaphor. And I just love this metaphor, and maybe I take it too far. Sexual harassment is like an iceberg, okay? Has anybody here seen Shrek? Right? So you know how ogres are like onions? Sexual harassment is like an iceberg. So the vast majority of sexual harassment is below the waterline. It's gender harassment. So if you ask people to fill out surveys and you ask them, have you experienced sexual harassment recently? First of all, they're likely to not answer at all, to not return the survey. But if they do, they're really likely to say no. But if you then give them a survey that says, have you been interrupted? Has someone talked down to you? Have you been treated as a second-class citizen? Have you been bullied? Oh yeah, that's happened, that's happened, that's happened. Gender harassment is just as damaging as the above-the-waterline harassment when it's pervasive and repeated. And you don't need to recognize that it's sexual harassment for that to be true. Right? We internalize what we're being told by everyone around us. And so even if we don't know to label it as sexual harassment, it is still damaging targets, damaging bystanders, and damaging the community. So why then am I so optimistic? Okay, so why is the iceberg frozen? It's frozen because it is in a cold environment. Each of these instances of sexual harassment is not the root cause of harassment, it's a symptom. The root cause is the temperature of the water. So in another analogy, if someone has a bacterial infection and they spike a fever, give them an aspirin to reduce the fever, right? Fever can be dangerous, it can kill you, but treating their fever alone is not enough because it's just a symptom. You have to give them antibiotics to get to the root cause. You have to treat the system of the human being to get rid of the toxins. So here, we could play whack-a-mole. Every time somebody says something that's a put-down, we could take a pickaxe and chip that bit of the iceberg away. But if the water's cold, we're not going to be able to get rid of the iceberg. The only thing that we can do is warm the water. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't hold people accountable for their behaviors, right? If you have people committing assault, people coercing others for sex, we need administrators, authority figures to take care of that. That's not something that I, as a Joe community member, can do. I don't want to do it. I don't have the ability to do it. But the same way that we need administrators to take care of the stuff above the waterline, administrators really have no power to change the temperature of the water below the waterline. Because the hydrogen bonds that hold this water together are the energy of social bonds between each and every one of us. Okay? That's so important. What makes our environment healthy, what makes our environment one in which everyone can thrive, the social bonds between us. So it used to be thought that you shouldn't bring your whole self to work. So when I was an assistant professor in the last century, I didn't put up pictures of my kids in my office. Because I was told if you do that, people will come in and see that I'm a mother and think, well, she's probably not really committed. She might leave. She's going to go home at 5 o'clock and not be as committed as the people who don't have children. The message that we send people to not bring their whole selves to work is that there's part of them that we don't value, that there's part of them that we want to be invisible. But now it's recognized that people spend more time at work and with coworkers often than they do with friends and family. And that you can't turn off who you are when you walk into the building. And even if you could, who you are when you walk into the building, all of you, is what makes you able to contribute in your unique way to the community. And so the kind of code switching that people do of being one kind of person at home and trying to conform to the norm at work is really damaging. And instead, we should encourage people to bring their whole selves to work. We should be giving people the message every way that we can that we value them for who they are. And if we do that, then we warm the temperature of the water. It's something that we can take control of. We don't have to wait for administrators to hand us down solutions from above. And that's because what's below the waterline, what creates that cold water, is really simple. This is so simple, right? My rule of thumb is don't be a jerk. That's incivility. Don't be uncivil. So that's low-intensity behavior with ambiguous attempt to harm the target in violation of workplace norms for mutual respect. That comes from the report. And if you can spot what's erroneous there, it's not in violation of workplace norms. People behave exactly the way we expect them to. So we have to change the workplace norms to be those of civility and respect. It's just rude and uncourteous behavior that shows disregard for others. I've done this, right? That's how I was brought up in science. It was putting down other people to show that I was smarter than they were, to show that I could get results better than they could, to show that I could, be really accomplished. That's when sexual harassment takes place. It takes place in the context of that kind of incivility, an environment of generalized disrespect. So that said, does that really give us a blueprint of what we can do? It's one thing to say, oh, this is so easy, don't be a jerk. But you guys aren't jerks, right? So you're already doing it. What can you really do to make things better? So this report tells us something important. It says, make the entire academic community responsible for reducing and preventing sexual harassment. So there are lots of student groups and lots of postdoc groups that have been working toward equity for a long time. So my thesis is that it's the faculty that need to step up, especially faculty with tenure. And it's also the staff. So the staff and the faculty are groups that have longitudinal investments in the university and who are fairly protected from at least some kinds of retaliation. In addition, what we know from the report and from the literature is that we cannot make the targets of sexual harassment bear the work of change. So faculty, men and women, need to step up. So I want to say one more thing about the iceberg. Oops. Another transformative thing for me about this metaphor is that it shifts the discussion from talking about blame to talking about responsibility. So over the years when I talk to people, mostly men, about sexual harassment, they tend to get pretty defensive. Now, that might be because I said, "You harasser!" But even when I try to have a nice conversation, people tend to get defensive. But if we see these instances just as symptoms, then we don't have to really talk about, "Oh, you just said something rude, you just said something insensitive." What we need to do is focus on the positive of being respectful and kind to each other each and every day. And so it's not about who's to blame for the symptoms, because we're all responsible for setting that environment that allowed those symptoms to occur. So how do we do that? It's all about social bonds. So here, what's a unit? A unit might be a graduate program, a unit might be one lab, a unit might be a department, a unit might be a school. It might be all of those things. But within units, we need to build social bonds. And so if you have a group of students, in giving these talks, I visited in genome sciences. And in genome sciences, they give their students $2,000 every year to program career development stuff. Those students bond together through doing that. They decide together what their goals are for that year. And it really promotes those social bonds. My department doesn't do anything like that. I don't even know the names of the students in most of the labs in my department. I really don't. And then interactions between units are so important because they help us recognize the difference between healthy and toxic environments. Maybe you're in a situation that's pretty harmful, but to you it's always been that way. You haven't experienced anything else. Boy, wouldn't it help you to talk to peers from different environments and learn that it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe you've learned from a peer in a different environment specific things that they do to make their workplace better. We can all learn from talking to people like that. When we build community, we increase the opportunities to model the kinds of behaviors that reflect our values. And really, every time we interact with people, we can show them that we value them as individuals. Okay, so that's where below the waterline comes in. That's where this discussion comes into it. So people from below the waterline are spreading out across campus and giving discussion presentations like this to tell you about the message of the report. You can give this presentation by downloading it from belowthewaterline.org. You can talk to your family about it over Thanksgiving. It beats talking politics, right? So read the report, or at least read Chapter 7's summary. Anybody who wants us to come in will come in and do this presentation. Now let's say we've come in and we've done this presentation, and you say, "You know what, we do have some problems." You can ask us to come in and moderate a discussion in your unit about what your local problems are. We'll come in again once you've identified those local problems and help you brainstorm what you can do about them. And we can do all of this with no cost, with no mandate, with no permission. We can just do it. We're also starting 2 programs, and Sarah has a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to volunteer. So one of these programs is called Peer Responders. So for peer responders, you would volunteer for a database of people who would be on call. If someone has experienced below the waterline harassment, they'll contact us at below the waterline and say, "You know, I need somebody I can talk to about this." Not as a counselor, not in a professional way, but as a community member who can listen to them, validate their experience, and tell them that is not okay with us. That is not what you ought to be able to expect from your community. That behavior does not reflect our community values. If you want to bring someone with you to talk to your advisor or your chair or your program director about what happened, the peer responder can go with you. Of course, the peer responder can also hand people a sheet of local resources. But the idea is that we are not responding to above the waterline harassment, which clearly needs a more educated professional approach, but that we want to reduce the isolation of people who've experienced gender harassment and change the social norm, make sure they understand that's not okay with us. We also have another program that we're starting called Faculty Allies. So a lot of times, some departments are great. You know all the faculty in your program. They're supportive. And so if the one person you're working with isn't meeting your needs, you can just talk to other people. But not everyone has that. Faculty allies are people that you can be connected with to just help you troubleshoot how to get what you need from your training. If harassment means that you don't feel comfortable getting some mentoring resource there, we can help you talk over where else you can get it. Faculty allies will just help you navigate through the situation. They're not going to be able to fix it, but they can help you navigate through it to reduce its impact on your professional development, and hopefully also to let you recognize that people can stand up for you. So when I was an assistant professor, I experienced pretty bad harassment, and my peers stood up for me. And that completely changed my view of the experience, telling me that, you know what, the people here at the University of Washington are generally good. There are a few bad actors, and they can make you miserable. But when people stand up for you, when people help you get through it, it lets you continue with your career, it lets you continue with your life, and see it as just one of those things that you can survive instead of something that really causes permanent damage. So wrapping up, this report is got so much more to it, right? It's 300 pages. It's got all kinds of research on details of the effects of harassment on targets. It talks about diffusing hierarchical mentoring structures, the roles and responsibilities of institutions. But what I want to leave you with is this quote that really speaks to me. Placing responsibility and control for sexual harassment planning and responses at the highest administrative levels guided by attorneys would likely produce a different organizational culture and climate than when guided by faculty, students, and service providers. In other words, we could let the administrators and lawyers figure out how to solve this problem, but we would not like the outcome. If we want this environment to reflect our values at the grassroots, then we also need grassroots change. So I've taken actually up way more time than I expected to, but what kinds of questions do you guys have? Sarah's going to come up and moderate a discussion. And if anybody needs to leave, I won't be offended.
Can we thank her that they're going?
Yeah.
I guess one thing that our department has been talking about, and you've alluded to a lot, and this is something that Liz has done, and I know diversity committees and many of our departments focus on, is there are people in our departments that care and are trying to do stuff, but at least my involvement in the past 3 years has felt a lot like having the same conversation with faculty members over and over and over again and nothing happening. And then, you know, so we host an event like this, but there's only one faculty member from my department here. You know, so like, what do you do? Like, what else can we do? I've been spending a lot of time that students shouldn't spend in service to departments, working on this to no avail. And it's kind of, I mean, I don't know what else you do.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think that we can't keep putting the onus on targets and on trainees to make this change. But it really helps, I think, and I'll go to Sarah in a minute. It really helps to know what you're asking for. And when you're asking for change, that might not be specific enough, but you can go in and tell your faculty, I want to make a presentation to you about this report, or I want to bring in someone from below the waterline to talk to faculty about this report. We clearly need faculty to step up.
Yeah, I would also reflect on what kind of risk you are personally in with your funding and with your relationship with your advisor, and how squeaky of a wheel can you be. So take some time to evaluate that landscape of risk, and then go right up to the line where you want the amount of energy and the amount of risk that you want to engage with, and stay right there. You don't have to sacrifice and martyr yourself. You have to go right up to the space where you can.
I think that our department in general, like even faculty members I talk to, are wanting to do this, but nothing ever happens. like, I don't know, we can talk all day, but that doesn't.
Yeah, so we can come in and do a discussion to identify the things that your department wants to work on. Changing the whole environment is pretty overwhelming a thing to think about, but we can moderate a discussion that is, let's identify a couple things.
The other thing I would reflect is that what happens, like, the most important moment is to identify when someone is actually in acute need, is actually being harassed, that person can find a peer group, find people to go to. So it's also this attending to the acute needs as they occur, so that, like, resources can be met and people can show up. Yeah.
Building off of that comment, I wonder if there's, and I don't know, what you guys have available, but it seems to me that there does need to be kind of a, peer group for faculty, because what I've seen is that faculty who want to help, they don't know what to do, and so they do nothing until you, say it enough, that it's like, okay, now I'm forced to do something. And there's a time lag too with that, right?
Yeah.
There's a time lag between when harassment starts and when a faculty member is notified, and then there's a time lag between when they're notified and when they do or don't take action.
Yeah.
And by that time, the person in the situation has been in it for far too long.
Yeah, damage has been done.
Yeah, so I guess the question that I'm posing is, is it possible then to create some sort of mentorship program for faculty so that they can feel that they can go ask these questions of someone, what are my options? Because I think sometimes to them there are two options, it's like remove the student from the position or do nothing. And neither seems palatable, and so they're stuck.
And they're also up against the expectation that they will report to the university if they're mandated to report. And so we are in a situation where people can't come and have guaranteed confidentiality with university representatives. And so that is back to the very problematic place of legal compliance versus a culture that believes women, a culture that starts from the grassroots. So I just want to bear witness to what you just said as very appropriate, and I think that could be amended in some of the plans.
Yeah, so
Peer group.
if you have faculty members that don't know where to go, we're trying to get the word out. They can contact us at Below the Waterline. And again, we might not have the answer, but enough of us have been in that position where we can coach each other through it. Or at least help that faculty member think through some relevant questions. So whether they can step up that time or whether it's going to take till next time, we want to increase people's skills at navigating through these situations.
But I think just to follow up with what Jessica asked about, it's sort of like, what are the tools to warm the temperature among the faculty, right? Because that's, for me, the most powerful takeaway here is,
Yeah.
We all look at the ice and want to chip away at it, but I agree with you, the root cause is that climate that you live in. And so what are the tools to give to the community, actually, to raise the temperature, to use your analogy?
Yeah.
And I think we could use that help. Oh yeah, what are some of those tools? Maybe they're not super complicated, right? Build community, build bonds.
Happy hours, newsletters that tell you what's going on in the lives of your colleagues. Put up pictures of community members in public spaces. Create opportunities to interact, right? We don't actually need help interacting when we're in the same space. So science nights, retreats, holiday parties, they sound so trivial, but when you look at departments that have really good environments, they do all those things. And I'd say in my department that's been kind of hard because these things get scheduled and people don't come. There's an inertia associated with it. But that's in part because we haven't explained to people the benefit they can get from coming.
Yeah, I think looking directly at the brokers of power and using the language of moral courage and indicting inaction as lacking moral courage. And so it takes us as change agents to be willing to be in that uncomfortable position to say, this is true, this is what the evidence shows us, these are the pathways forward. But again, if that continually puts the onus of action on the shoulders of people who have already experienced harassment. We have this unequal labor component of public action, and that actually, squaring with that is one of the fundamentally most difficult things, and that's why a lot of these conversations are facilitated so much more richly when men do show up, right? Because by and large, the culture of academia thinks that dealing with harassment is a mundane HR chore. It's not. It's actually fundamentally about flipping the table of who has legitimacy and voice and power and buy-in in the culture, right? And so there's this other thing that we're actually trying to do.
Yeah.
Not HR.
So faculty often don't realize the power that we have. And I think that through sessions like this, we can let faculty know that, in fact, we do have a lot of power. You know, by golly, I have tenure. What can they do to me? But I've also seen over and over again the goodness and caring of my faculty colleagues. They really do want to help. And so by getting together and talking over and identifying, let's find one small thing that we can do to help. That's positive reinforcement when it helps. And then we can do the next small thing. If we wait to receive the answer from above, it's just never going to happen. And so this report, I think, can be a real catalyst because it's a mandate that we have to do something.
Can I talk about a more concrete scenario that, you know, even this room is largely students. I think many people can identify with here. So students repeatedly see, especially female students, repeatedly see gender harassment happening. You know, maybe the door's open when an advisor's meeting with a student, they overhear something, you know, or whatever. So this is specifically focused on the advisor-student power dynamic. So students seem to have very broad knowledge of these examples, but then filtering that information up to someone who has power over that bad actor seems to me part of where the bottleneck is. So there's, you know, maybe people who are in positions of power over bad actors don't realize who the bad actors are or specific examples of what to do. And so can you make any recommendations for how to set up essentially like information flow avenues to get that information to the people who need it, who then hopefully can take responsibility to do something about it?
Yeah, that's why is it that students keep going to the same labs where people have problems over and over and over again? I think there's two components to it. One is the lack of shared information, and the other is the power of denial that makes a student think that they can get through it. The star phenomenon of star academics that we all want to work with, it affects students too. Students want to work with the star too. And so changing the culture to value caring and respect and mentoring over perceived fame is hard. So there are online reporting tools that UW doesn't subscribe to at the moment, but other institutions are starting, and they might get more popular, where you can anonymously report something, and it's released only when there's a second or third report. But in the meantime, you know, locally, you can start a list to share with the incoming students. You can document things in an anonymous way so that sometimes it's hard to be anonymous because everybody will know. But to the extent that you feel safe, you know, share the information.
The other thing is that if you're a graduate student here, you're part of the graduate student union.
Yeah.
And you can use a union grievance avenue to address sexual harassment, and I have colleagues that have done that.
Yeah, so I guess I'm specifically referring to the setting of trying to be being an advocate for someone who does not feel empowered to speak up directly.
I think that in part speaks to our desire to build a volunteer network, so we can have like peer-to-peer responders, so people can come in and say, yeah, this is a really confusing process. You are in a deeply disempowered place, and we want to be able to show up for you peer-to-peer and help you talk through what are the options in front of you, because maybe that person doesn't understand that there's a union protocol. They don't understand that there's the
And every situation is different, and so we can't really say X, Y, Z. And so that's the hope that the peer responders will, either because they have the information or they can talk to other peer responders, help talk about what sorts of things have worked before.
Another thing that goes on in this case is that graduate students will know things, but we know things at the level of so-and-so told so-and-so 3 years ago this happened. And, what do you do with that information? I don't feel comfortable reporting that because it's hearsay, but it's also going to affect which lab I choose. How do you deal with that information?
I don't have an answer to that one.
I mean, it depends on what you've heard, right? And so in certain cases, like colleagues of mine knew that a PI had drugged and raped a student. And so I don't have firsthand experience. I don't even know the victim. But in that case, that's a very serious violation. There's a framework essentially of whistleblowing in that case. So that's a far extreme where you whistleblow publicly. And that's not exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about very gradations over here where there's a rumor of bad behavior. I would say those whisper networks are really, really important. Like that's how we actually keep each other safe in a lot of situations.
That's something we talked about in our group, and then what about the people who aren't social? It's
Yeah.
like we both have benefited from the day we started our programs and the day we became part of this community of
Yeah.
receiving those rumors.
Yeah, the people in isolation, right, that are the most
Right,
vulnerable.
yeah.
And oftentimes those could be international graduate students, people who have other intersections of compounding minoritization, and totally agree. And I don't think we have a great.
Yeah, so the longer term answer is that those are symptoms and we want to work on the root causes.
Yeah.
But that's really also why we have peer responders and faculty allies, because people who are in a bad situation now can't wait. But I do think that we can make more rapid change than has ever been possible before using this National Academy report as a tool. That we can say, look, there's science here, there are data here that tell us we need to do something, and the report has these ideas. We want a conversation around them. It's not blaming to say we want to improve our environment and culture.
Yeah, I get in these conversations all the time where there's this idea like science is this like gas in the atmosphere that we've like tapped into, and empiricists are like, there's just the way and the light, right? And it's very closed-minded to the social and cultural reality of building institutions inside of political entities, right? Everything that we're a part of is derived from our narratives and our constructs and the systems of discrimination, right? We're a product of that. So empiricists don't like that narrative because it makes things muddy and it messes up their pristine empirical waters. But we can circumvent that through this evidence-based framework and say, actually, this is also empiricism. This is also the intersection of empiricism, data gathering, and institutional health. So you have to, in some cases, you have to like argue around, you like circle the toilet bowl drain with these bad faith arguments, Yeah, and that's where the peer-to-peer, like that's the thing is like some people have we're 6 months, 8 months into doing this, and I mean, there's people that are more empowered to speak directly, and that's where that peer-to-peer network could be. Maybe, yeah.
I was going to ask, does the report highlight any institutions or organizations that already do this well that can be benchmarked against?
No. This is a trans-institutional problem, and you can see why. It's because we don't have separate pools of water, right? We are all embedded in the same medium. our students go from one place to the other, our faculty go from one place to the other, and that's been part of the root problem that, you know, the secondhand smoke travels and contaminates, but it's also a strength of this model because we can be positive role models to other places. So the change can start today, right here, and what we do can have a positive impact on others.
Yeah, I would say also that the culture tells us that, again, these are mundane HR chores, but when we elevate conferences, for example, building diversity and inclusivity statements and statements about safe practices, when we together say, thank you conference, thank you professional society, when we elevate that to a level of professional acclaim and real value in the community, that's part of that cultural shift. So we need to push back on those devaluing narratives of this work.
Because I feel like for myself as a faculty member, a big part of this is awareness. So we kind of have the censoring of all the people who don't show up, and you wonder, why didn't more people show up today? Do they think I'm not a part of the problem, or do they think there's not that much of a problem due to their
Yeah, I
isolation?
think they think there's not that much of a problem, I'm not a part of the problem, and I don't know what to do about the problem. So you can go to the chair and say, I want this to be a departmental discussion.
Yeah, we should really give Patrick a hand for that.
Yep.
But one thing that I think a lot about, and that really frustrates me in a lot of this work, is I feel like I get a lot of this in a PhD, and I get where it comes from. Like, a PhD is not supposed to be easy, right? Like, we all know that. It is not easy work. But I think there's also another group of people that think, I did it.
Hazing.
Yeah, it's like a fraternity. That's why
Yeah.
I always call the PhD a something garbage. But I think a lot of people, like myself, I make that joke all the time, but I think there's a lot of faculty members, and I've heard it, especially from older women faculty, that
But you know what? Those people, we have to assume that almost all people are good people who want to do better, and we need to take advantage of peer pressure. So I'm one of those older women, and when I go, the first time I talked about this at my faculty meeting, I was met with a wall of silence. But I keep talking about it, and people have come to discussions like this, and they are open to it, and they do care about the well-being of their faculty colleagues and postdocs and students and staff. And so peer pressure can make a really big difference. We don't need everyone to jump on board. We just need a few people to set a good example for others.
That's great. Yeah, I love the framework of how one individual who demonstrates respect and dignity can change like the ambience in a whole lab or department. And
Yeah.
I've definitely seen that happen. The woman I did my PhD with, like, her leadership changed the institution culture there. Yeah.
I'm not sure how prevalent this is university-wide, but I know there are a lot of fields where a graduate student is partnered with some sort of external agency to do their work, and that external agency is benefiting from and often funding that research. And often members of that external agency are on the graduate students committee or otherwise have like a really prominent role in their research. And I have only done a little bit of digging into this, but it seems to me that there's not, there are some mechanisms within a university to deal with harassment, but that this external agency scenario, which is actually quite common, it doesn't seem to be that there are any mechanisms at all. But I was wondering if,
I mean, that's part of the hierarchical power structures. The report talks about diffuse mentoring networks, so that ideally you would have many mentors looking out for you who also talk to each other to prevent people from falling through the cracks. That said, sexual harassment is worse in academic science than in any other workplace except for the military. So odds are that whatever this external agency is, it's not any worse than we are. We need research to tell us how the prevalence of harassment changes in those situations. But mostly when something goes wrong, we need people to be paying attention, and we need for people who are experiencing that negative environment to feel empowered to ask for help. If you know that your faculty advisors care about your well-being and put that on a pedestal, then it's easier to, to ask for help.
I see the catering people roll by a few times. I think that might need to
Okay.